Okay, so let's start our turn from stereotypes, one component of that negative attitude that people might have towards other groups, to discrimination, another component of it, the behavioral component. So discrimination, the negative or harmful action toward a person because of their group membership. So not the thoughts about another group, not the feelings about another group, but the actual behaviors that um, uh, one might engage in toward another group. And I know I'm trying to make these distinctions very carefully, but as we'll see, all these things are really tied together and can kind of cause and reinforce one another. So even as I'm making these distinctions, I'm going to start talking about emotions again here in a bit and how these things are based on stereotypes. Just to remind you, I was talking a little bit before about the stereotype content model, way of breaking down stereotypes into warmth and competence dimensions, and you can see how in one sample of people, how they perceived different groups along these different dimensions, some being high in warmth, high in competence, low in warmth, low in competence, high in warmth, low in competence, and low in warmth, high in competence. So these consistent and ambivalent stereotypes that people might have. Expanding on these ideas from the stereotype content model, Susan Fisk and her colleagues developed a way of predicting the types of behaviors or discriminations that we might see towards different groups, or the types of facilitating or harming behaviors going on. The very cute acronym they came up with this was Behaviors from Intergroup Affect and Stereotypes, the bias map. But this tells us something about how we can expect different sorts of emotions and behaviors from the place that people are found on the map here. So I talked a bit before about how warmth is kind of primary in the SCM, how it was necessary in at least an ancestral environment to figure out someone's intentions before figuring out if they could carry them out. So warmth is kind of more important or primary here. So because it's primary, warmth in their conceptualization is related to more active behaviors. So things that you're doing intentionally or going out of your way to doing. And you can either engage in active facilitation, doing something intentionally to help a group, or active harm, doing something intentionally to stand in their way, or keep something from them, take something from them, or hurt them very literally. The other dimension, competence, it's still very important, but it's not primary in the way warmth is. Competence, Cuddy, Fisk, and Glick say, is related to more passive behaviors. So letting a group get ahead or letting a group fall behind would be passive facilitation or passive harm. So warmth and competence are related to these different types of behaviors. And they also have emotions on this map, emotions that are related to those different quadrants that we had before. So groups that you hold in high regard on both dimensions, high warmth, high competence, these are groups that you would admire. Groups that are low in warmth, low in competence, groups that you would hold in contempt. Groups that are high in warmth, low in competence, groups that you would pity. Groups that are high in competence and low in warmth would be groups that you would envy. And the main thrust of this map is that wherever these groups fall, you can predict the types of behaviors and emotions that are going to be associated with them. So groups that you hold in high regard, these ones that are high warmth, high competence, you admire them, you help them actively, and you help them passively. Ones you hold in contempt, with low warmth and low competence, you hurt them passively, and you hurt them passively and you hurt them actively. Maybe more interesting things we find are for the ambivalent stereotype quadrants here, the high warmth, low competence, and high competence, low warmth. So pitied groups are going to receive passive harm and active facilitation, and envied groups are going to receive active harm and passive facilitation. The groups that you hold in contempt are the ones that are going to get both types of harm. So what I mean by active and passive things here, let's use pitied groups as an example. Groups like people with mental or physical handicaps or the elderly sometimes are put into this quadrant. So these might be groups that are actively facilitated in the sense that there are specific policies or movements to help them. There are charities in place to help them. People generally endorse the idea of helping these groups. Think about like nursing homes or summer camps for children with intellectual disabilities and things like that. There are things that we are explicitly trying to do to help these groups that we might put in this area. However, we might then passively harm them by distancing ourselves from them socially, or not, going to visit the elderly in a nursing home. We help them by putting them in a home that's able to take care of their needs, but then we harm them by keeping ourselves away from them and not being involved and making those social connections. So we might help groups in one way and harm them in another, and this kind of works in related but opposite ways for those groups that we envy. We might allow them to do things, but then when there are policies we can enact to get in their way, then we are going to do it, basically. So there are lots of different types of reactions we can have to these groups, and this is just one way that researchers have conceptualized this. So that I wanted to talk about this right after talking about the stereotype content model, just so that stuff was fresh in your mind. But there are lots of other ways that researchers have thought about discrimination. If we go back to one of our old white men friends that study these things, as many of the people that we talk about in many parts of this class were because of historical and cultural pressures and circumstances, Gordon Allport was one of those people. And he obviously studied discrimination a lot, and he came up with 5 different levels of it. We don't need to go into tons of detail about each of these, but you can see that they get increasingly direct and troubling as you go up the scale, from verbal prejudice to avoidance, exclusion, physical attack, and extermination. Again, this is kind of underlying the idea that these are all based on some of the same psychological tendencies and processes, but the way that we discriminate against groups can vary wildly, from things that seem innocuous to the most evil things that you can think of, basically. A couple distinctions I want to make here about the types of discrimination that I think are important to mention for our class. Blatant discrimination is one of the ones we'll mention. This is the type of discrimination that you see that is, usually intentional, something that is not trying to be hidden. You can document this relatively easily. Sometimes, depending on the context and the target group, it is illegal and socially condemned, but it really depends on who is being discriminated against. But blatant discrimination, again, it's very obvious. You know it when you see it. And we have lots of, historical examples of what we might call blatant discrimination, like not giving women the right to vote until shockingly recently, and keeping people that had a particular color skin from using facilities, bathrooms, restrooms, lunch counters, whatever it happened to be. So I think when we think about blatant discrimination and these really obvious things, a lot of times we kind of have these black and white images in our minds. And a lot of times I think that gives some people the false sense that these things might be less common, but it definitely is not gone. And I think, especially when you're younger and you read about these things in textbooks in junior high and high school, they kind of talk about these things as things of the past. But really it's more that the target groups that are involved in these things changed. When it's no longer to be no longer acceptable to discriminate against black people or women, then the types of discrimination that are really obvious just kind of go away by going underground. And the way that we discriminate against them changes by becoming more subtle. And the groups that we then discriminate against blatantly just kind of shift. That it might end up being people like immigrants or Muslims or trans people instead of black people or women explicitly. So the types of signs that people that are going to regret them later hold might change a little bit in terms of the target groups, but blatant discrimination never really goes away, unfortunately. The target groups just sort of change and shift with the times. So subtle discrimination, which I've already kind of alluded to, is a little bit different. It's not as obvious. It's generally going to be harder to document, and sometimes it can even be unintentional. A lot of times, subtle discrimination is sort of baked into the systems in our lives and the institutions in our lives and the cultural things that we view as just normal. That old idea of, a fish not knowing the water because it's swimming in it, right? I'm sure I butchered that, but you know what I mean, that, we kind of swim in this sea of institutionalized discrimination, so it's hard for us to even perceive it sometime if it's not directly affecting us. These things, just to kind of give you a bit of an example, I talked about one earlier where, you're using these different particular labels to describe people in different jobs. But other types of subtle discrimination, like humor that we might use against other types of groups, the way that we might talk about groups in a patronizing way, or emphasizing the differences between different groups, or I guess that gets to my example earlier about saying like a female CEO or a male nurse. Being able to use words to sort of make group boundaries a little bit different again. So obviously this is not the only way we subtly discriminate. This is like a more, individual or social level way of subtly discriminating. But subtle discrimination is, again, baked into our institutions and hiring practices and the way people get mortgages and who's pulled over by the police and the way people get opportunities in all different segments of life. So subtle discrimination is, I don't want to give the impression that it's just this or it's just a couple things. Like, it is a pervasive thing that goes on throughout, almost every aspect of society and culture. I have a video here that I think is definitely worth watching. I'm not going to play it here just so this video doesn't have to be another 3 or 4 minutes long, but I would urge you to take a look at it. It is probably not going to tell most people things they don't already know, but I think it makes a really clear point about how just because of a different identity that somebody might have, they might have very different outcomes in different parts of their lives. So I'll leave you with that, and once I get back from this video, I will talk about one specific example from it and expand on it just a little bit.